Hello, and I'm going to be doing my persuasive speech today, and I'm going to be doing my persuasive speech on tax avoidance, and I'm going to be arguing that tax avoidance is morally permissible as long as the percent tax an individual avoids is equal to the percent of government spending that is discretionary spending. So, I know everybody is a little iffy on tax avoidance, especially when it comes to the corporate scene. Some people don't appreciate the fact that corporations can miss out on spending billions of dollars in taxes, which could indeed help society. So I will not be arguing that corporate tax avoidance is morally permissible. There's been it's widely agreed upon that it's not morally permissible for a corporation to do so. But we are going to be talking about individual tax avoidance. So people should be wanting to listen to this, because I'll tell you that it is not wrong for you to miss out on some of your taxes. So we're going to talk about first some arguments against the moral permissibility of individual tax avoidance. And I've got Mr. Feelho here, and Mr. Feelho has a deontological and a utilitarian lens, which he looks at tax avoidance through his utilitarian lens. Well, firstly, I'll define some utilitarian aspects. So utilitarians have this thing about utility, and if a action diminishes or promotes utility, that determines the moral permissibility. So for tax avoidance, there is taxpayer utility and societal utility. He finds that taxpayers perceive greater utility through avoiding instead of paying, so taxpayer utility increases. And he finds the societal utility diminishes as long as the society or the government isn't a negative force. So they're not spending unwisely, unjustly. So if you avoid unjust spending, or if you avoid taxes that would go towards unjust spending, that would actually increase utility. But we're going to assume that it's a case-by-case thing. So that's not really the part of his argument that I'm really going to want to discuss about. But his deontological argument, on the other hand, is very interesting. So he has his defined maxim, which he then puts through the first categorical imperative test. So we'll go over this maxim first. So the maxim that he describes for his deontological argument would be: taxpayers always make use of tax avoidance arrangements to reduce their tax liabilities. So if you know how to avoid, you should avoid. Basically what he's saying. And then through the first categorical imperative test, and if you don't know what that is, it states that you should act only in accordance with that maxim, through which you can at the same time will that it will become a universal law. So if you wish that something will happen, then you also wish that it's a universal law. So if you wish that you could know the amount of the tax code that helps you avoid certain taxes, well, you want every single person to do that as well. And he found that this would hurt society, very much so. And he found that the significant decrease to state revenue would make it morally impermissible. But going back to the utilitarian thing, we're going to go ahead and we're going to restate that I'm not talking about this when I'm going to be discussing why his argument is not a good argument against my argument. He could have a good argument, but against my argument, and why his how it still doesn't encompass why mine is morally permissible. We're going to say that I find the defined maxim to be inapplicable to mine, so it doesn't hurt mine. I will explain why it's not applicable, and I will define a more applicable maxim that shows my deontological version of the argument to basically show that deontology can be applied a little bit to my argument as well, but I just feel his maxim was a little bit off, and when you change it, it shows that it's a good argument. I'll restate his maxim first. So taxpayers always make use of tax avoidance arrangement strategies to reduce their tax liabilities. The first reason that this is not a very good maxim is the extent of it is not very clear. So how do you know how much an individual knows of their tax code? That's a universal thing that it's not very applicable to society. You can't know. But to show this distinction, I will add this distinction into his maxim to see if it can even work with the distinction known. So taxpayers always make use of the tax avoidance arrangements that they are knowledgeable of to reduce its tax liability. So now it's just an overarching thing. You don't need to know how much someone knows. You just assume that they will act on however much they do know. But with this, it's impossible to know how much every person knows, so you would never be able to fully do the first categorical imperative test, so on and so forth. But now I will provide my altered maxim that encompasses the aspects of my argument. So here we go. Our government must always explicitly educate a taxpayer on how its taxes will be spent. If this knowledge is not explicitly provided, the taxpayer must always use the tax avoidance arrangements that are knowledgeable to them to avoid that amount of taxes in which he is ignorant to the how in which these taxes are spent. So, for the first categorical imperative test, this maxim would imply a taxpayer will desire other taxpayers to use the tax avoidance arrangements that they are knowledgeable of to avoid the amount of taxes that they are unknowledgeable of where they are going. This encompasses my argument because of the discretionary aspect. So now I will more detailedly define my argument. I will first describe some rights I feel that every person has, or taxpayers have. So taxpayers have the right to explicitly know where their taxes are spent, and taxpayers also have the right to educate themselves on the tax code of the country they preside in. These are basic transparency rights, and most individuals would agree that they should know where their taxes are going. Discretionary spending is a percentage of government spending that you do not know where it goes because the mandatory spending is defined, and you can look it up and you can go see in most countries, but discretionary spending is usually determined well after the taxes are already paid. So since they don't know where their taxes are going, I find that to be a little weird. So I will now introduce a new right that I feel that people have. I would like to say that if a taxpayer is kept from being able to explicitly know where their taxes are spent, then the taxpayer has the right to use their knowledge of the tax code to avoid taxes that are the percentage equivalent of the taxes spent that they do not know where they are going. So I didn't include discretionary in there just because discretionary implies that you do not know. So I would now like to introduce the main part of my argument, which is an analogy. So a person walks into a clothing store and picks out the clothes that they would wish to buy. They go up to the cash register, and the cashier scans all the items, and a price shows up on the screen. Then the cashier tells you that this clothing store has a required mandatory random purchase. This purchase is usually around 40% of the original purchase. The customer does not want to buy this mandatory random purchase, so he asks if there's a way to avoid it. The cashier points to a sign that says if you neatly fold everything and place them on the counter, then you avoid this mandatory random purchase. The customer does this and they leave the store. I would like to connect everything by stating that in discretionary taxes, that is the equivalent to the mandatory random purchase. The mandatory government spending would be the clothes that you picked out that you know that you were going to get. And I would like to say that the sign that shows you how to avoid the mandatory random purchase is the tax code of the country. So through that, if you disagree with my tax avoidance thesis, you would basically be disagreeing that that person was morally in the right to fold neatly their clothes and avoid that purchase. The only thing about my argument that I could see someone having a problem with is discretionary spending in most countries can be graphed after that year and show about where they spent most of the money discretionarily. So you can kind of think or predict how much of the taxes you think will go into these areas, but you'll never know. These graphs go up and down, so that bit of liability there does not give me any real strength to any kind of objection to my argument. In conclusion, I would like to iterate a misconception that could be taken by my argument, and I am not arguing that you are morally obligated or encouraged to avoid the taxes. I am just saying that it is morally permissible that if you do not know where your taxes are being spent, you have the right to not pay those taxes. It's a percentage equivalent type of deal, and I find that a person that feels that bit of randomness and you're willing to put your money on the line there, I find that to be very, I would discourage that type of behavior. And I think that government transparency is a very prominent thing that should be introduced into our society so that these people that avoid their taxes now have a reason to pay them because they know where they're going. Thank you.